I was in the back seat of our car, contractions ripping through me, while my husband was boarding a plane with his parents. He laughed before leaving, saying, "You can drive yourself." That single sentence carved into my chest deeper than the pain of childbirth. Greed, pride, arrogance, those were the gods he worshipped. He thought money and family reputation could erase the sight of a wife abandoned in labor. For 3 hours my phone rang, his name flashing with panic, and I let it die each time. Because in that silence, I found the beginning of my revenge. From the outside, my marriage looked flawless. Daniel was the kind of man who charmed waiters with effortless jokes and shook hands with confidence that made people lean in closer. At dinner parties, he placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me gently through the crowd, his smile wide and rehearsed. Friends often whispered to me, "You're so lucky, he's perfect." I smiled back, swallowing the bitter taste of a truth I couldn't share. That perfection was nothing more than a mask. Behind closed doors, the mask cracked. His words were not tender but sharp, hidden daggers coded in casual tones. "You're too sensitive," he'd say when I flinched at his sarcasm. "You'd be nothing without me," he'd add when I hesitated to ask for money. He rationed affection like a miser with coins, doling out just enough to keep me starving for more. And when I tried to argue, he turned my doubts into proof of my supposed weakness. "See? This is what I mean. You overreact. No one else would put up with you." It wasn't just him. His mother, Evelyn, perfected the art of polished cruelty. In public, she praised my cooking, my clothes, my efforts. In private, she slipped barbs into her words. "Daniel deserves someone strong," she'd murmur as I cleared dishes. "Someone who doesn't crumble under pressure." His father, Richard, rarely spoke to me at all, except to remind me that money, and who controlled it, was the only true power. Their message seeped into my bones. I was not enough, never enough, and I needed Daniel to survive. At first, I believed them. I thought love meant endurance, that loyalty meant silence. But small cracks widened with time, and I began to see patterns. I noticed how Daniel's jokes about me always centered on incompetence, how he tightened his grip on our finances after every argument, how he made sure I saw the emails about his new investments, but never let me touch the paperwork. The more I looked, the more the perfect mask dissolved. I began writing things down. Every insult, every lie. At night, when he fell asleep beside me, I slipped my phone beneath the sheets and recorded his voice when he muttered half-truths in anger. A digital trail of who he really was started forming, invisible to him but painfully clear to me. One evening, while sorting through our shared laptop, I stumbled on an email he must have forgotten to delete. The subject line was short: "Transfer complete." My pulse quickened as I opened it. It was a confirmation of funds moved into an offshore account. My name was nowhere in sight. He was preparing for something, and whatever it was, it didn't include me. Days later, curiosity gnawed at me until I searched through a drawer he had carelessly left unlocked. That was when I found the policy papers. A life insurance contract. My stomach twisted as my eyes ran over the lines. The insured, Daniel Carter. The beneficiary, not me, not his wife, not the mother of his unborn child. It was his mother, Evelyn. My breath caught. He was insuring his life for her benefit, tying me out of the equation altogether. I remember sinking onto the cold floor, the document trembling in my hands. Tears welled, hot and unrelenting, carving paths down my cheeks. It wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. I wasn't his partner. I wasn't his future. I was disposable, a placeholder until he secured what he truly cared about: wealth, power, and his family's approval. For the first time, I let myself cry without guilt, without trying to muffle the sound. My sobs filled the room, raw and uncontrollable, and in that release came a fragile moment of clarity. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. The cruelty was real. The deceit was real. And the mask, no matter how carefully Daniel wore it, was slipping. I closed my eyes, clutching the papers to my chest, And a thought whispered through the cracks of my despair. What if this had all been designed from the beginning? A perfect performance to lure me in, break me down, and trap me in a life where escape seemed impossible. And then another thought, darker and sharper, followed. What if I refused to play my part any longer? The night I discovered the insurance papers, something inside me broke, but something else quietly came alive. I realized if I wanted to survive, if I wanted my child to survive, I couldn't simply run. Daniel's power rested on appearance and control, and if I left with nothing but bruised pride and empty hands, he would crush me. I needed a plan, not a rebellion of passion, but a strategy of patience. So I smiled more. I made his coffee the way he liked, folded his shirts with crisp edges, and nodded when he mocked me. I became the obedient wife he believed I was, careful to mask the fire simmering underneath. It was almost theatrical. Every laugh I forced, every bow of my head rehearsed to perfection. He thought I was beaten. He thought he had won. That illusion was my shield. Behind the mask, I built a secret world of evidence. My phone became my weapon, recording arguments when his voice turned sharp, snapping photos of contracts he left on the counter, saving receipts he never imagined I would notice. At night, when he scrolled through his investments, I leaned casually beside him, pretending boredom, but my eyes tracked every figure, every signature. One morning, he stormed into the kitchen, muttering curses. His laptop had crashed during a transfer, and he blamed me for distracting him. Hours later, when I checked my inbox, there it was, a stray email accidentally copied to me. The subject line, "Asset relocation, urgent." My heart pounded as I opened it. There, in black and white, was confirmation that Daniel had wired a massive sum overseas. The mask slipped further. He wasn't just hiding wealth, he was preparing an escape, one that didn't include me. I stared at the email, fingers trembling over the delete button. If I erased it, no one would know. If I saved it, it could be the very stone that tipped the scales. But saving it meant staying silent, letting him believe I was blind. Could I endure the act longer, pretending I didn't know while he plotted his selfish future? My chest tightened with the weight of the choice. I saved it. The next step was finding allies. I couldn't wage this war alone. One afternoon, under the pretense of a doctor's visit, I slipped into the office of a woman named Claire, a lawyer recommended quietly by a support hotline. She listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her hands folded as I told her everything. When I finished, she leaned forward and whispered, "I know, I've been there, and you're not crazy." Her words struck me with the force of a revelation. She had once been trapped too, and she had clawed her way out. The bond between survivors needed no explanation. Claire taught me what evidence mattered in court, how to document without breaking laws, how to protect myself if Daniel grew suspicious. She didn't promise revenge. She promised justice. And for the first time in years, I felt a hand reach into the dark and pull me up. My network grew quietly. At the hospital, I reconnected with Dr. Harris, an old college acquaintance now working as an obstetrician. He had seen the bruises I tried to hide, the panic attacks I explained away. When I asked if he would testify about my health and stress during pregnancy, he didn't hesitate. "Whatever you need, Emily," he said. His voice carried no judgment, only steady support. And then there was Megan. Sweet, fierce Megan, my oldest friend, who had watched me drift away under Daniel's control. When I told her the truth, her face twisted with fury. "He left you in the car while you were in labor?" she spat. "We're going to burn him to the ground." She insisted on opening a hidden account in her name where I could stash small amounts of money. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A secret savings, a promise of independence. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drowning. The despair that had filled my chest after finding those papers began to thin. In its place flickered something fragile but unmistakable. Hope. I wasn't out yet. I wasn't safe yet. But the idea that I could be, that someday my child would grow up in a home not ruled by fear, was enough to keep me breathing. One night, as I lay awake listening to Daniel's steady snore, I clutched my phone with all the files, recordings, and screenshots saved in hidden folders, the weight of it pressed against my palm like a secret heartbeat. I turned to the ceiling, whispering to myself, "Not yet, not until the time is right." And still, the question gnawed at me. How long could I play the role of the dutiful wife before the act broke me? Patience became my second skin. To the world, to Daniel, I was still the wife who knew her place, smoothing the collar of his shirt before work, laughing politely at his stale jokes. But inside, I burned. Every word I spoke was measured, every glance rehearsed, because the smallest slip could unravel everything. I lived in the tension between survival and exposure, walking a tightrope without a net. There were nights when his temper flared unexpectedly, when the sharpness in his tone cut too close. He would slam a glass onto the counter, shards flying, or grip my wrist a second too long. In those moments, my instinct screamed to lash back, to end the charade, but I swallowed it down. My silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Yet more than once, I almost betrayed myself. One evening, he stormed through the living room, furious over a failed transaction, and threw himself onto the couch. I sat stiffly beside him, my phone hidden under a cushion, its recording app running. His tirade was cruel, a torrent of insults about my worth, my family, my supposed stupidity. My thumb hovered, ready to stop the recording if he shifted, but I didn't move. Then, suddenly, his eyes narrowed. He glanced toward the seat, leaning closer, his hand brushing against the fabric just inches above the hidden phone. My heart nearly stopped. For a breathless moment, I was sure he'd feel the shape, pull it out, and destroy everything. But he didn't. He reclined with a sneer, muttering one last insult, and I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That close call etched a lesson into me. Patience wasn't just about waiting. It was about knowing when to stay still, even as fire licked at your heels. During these silent months, I studied Daniel as though he were a puzzle to be solved. He believed himself clever, but patterns always betray. His greed surfaced whenever he spoke of money, his chest puffing with pride as he bragged about investments and hidden accounts. But when gossip turned against him at work or a colleague challenged his image, I saw his hands tremble, his voice tighten. He could not bear the weight of public shame. He was bold only in private. The stage of society made him fragile. I turned the same lens on Evelyn, his mother. Every family dinner was theater to her. She dressed in pearls even on weekdays, her words dripping with polished superiority. Yet beneath her elegance was desperation. Her eyes flickered anxiously whenever someone mentioned reputation, as though her entire identity balanced on the fragile approval of others. Her greed was not for money, but for status. Strip away her illusion of power, and she would crumble. Richard, the father, was simpler. He spoke rarely, but with finality, measuring all worth by financial figures. He cared little for people beyond their utility. His greed was pure, unvarnished, the hunger of a man who believed money alone defined legacy. Mapping their weaknesses became my obsession. If Daniel was vulnerable to shame, Evelyn to status, and Richard to money, then the path forward was clear. Target each by their own desires. Let their vices be the noose. And then came the twist I hadn't expected. It was Oliver, Daniel's cousin, always lingering at the edge of family gatherings, quiet, observant. I had dismissed him as background noise, another shadow in the Carter dynasty. But one night, after a particularly bitter dinner where Evelyn scolded me for failing to live up to their name, I caught Oliver's gaze. His eyes held something unusual, pity, maybe even defiance. Days later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a USB drive. My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop. Dozens of audio files filled the screen, each labeled with dates. I pressed play. Voices filled the room. Daniel's sharp commands, Evelyn's manipulative whispers, Richard's cold calculations. They weren't speaking to me. They were speaking about me. Schemes to cut me out of inheritance, discussions about transferring property into hidden trusts, even crude jokes at my expense. My chest tightened as the bile rose in my throat. But then I realized these were not my recordings. These files had been captured elsewhere. The final clip answered the question. Oliver's voice, low and tired, said, "If she ever finds this, maybe she'll know she's not alone." For the first time, I wasn't. The discovery spun my world again. The enemy's cracks were deeper than I imagined, fissures running through their perfect facade, and somewhere inside their fortress of greed and cruelty, a defector was feeding me their secrets. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the USB clutched in my hand. I whispered to myself, "Your own family is unraveling you, Daniel. You just don't know it yet." The question that lingered, sharp and electric, was whether I could wait long enough, play the obedient wife long enough, for the cracks to widen into collapse. The breaking point came on a Saturday evening in the warm glow of a dinner party Daniel insisted on hosting. The house smelled of roasted lamb, the table set with polished silver and wine glasses tall enough to intimidate. Our friends gathered, all of them charmed by Daniel's carefully constructed persona. He thrived in these settings, his voice booming, his laughter infectious. I sat at the far end of the table, silent, smiling politely when expected, though inside my stomach churned. It happened when someone innocently asked about the baby, about how excited he must be to become a father. Daniel smirked, swirling his wine with theatrical indifference, and said, "Excited? She's just a surrogate I married. She's here to pop out a kid, nothing more." Laughter erupted from a few guests, unsure if it was a joke. My chest tightened, the words slashing deeper than any insult he had hurled behind closed doors. The mask was off, and he didn't care who saw it. The room spun, but within that dizzying humiliation came clarity. This was the moment. There would be no more waiting, no more pretending. The fire I had banked for months roared to life, cold and sharp. That night, after the guests had gone and Daniel snored drunkenly on the couch, I sat alone in the glow of my laptop. My hands shook as I scrolled through the folders. Audio files, screenshots, financial transfers, the USB drive Oliver had given me. Years of cruelty, months of preparation, a digital history of a man who believed himself untouchable. With one deep breath, I attached the files and sent them to Claire, my lawyer. But in my haste, my finger slipped, and another address auto-filled in the line. Daniel's. The files flew into cyberspace, and I sat frozen, realizing what I had done. The email had gone to him too. I stared at the screen, the whoosh of the message sending echoing in my ears like a gunshot. My pulse raced as panic clawed at my throat. Had I ruined everything? Had I handed him the knife he would use against me? The answer came the next morning. Daniel burst into the kitchen, his phone clutched in his hand, his face pale with fury. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, waving the device. "Where did you get these?" His voice cracked, not with anger alone, but with fear. His arrogance slipped, replaced by desperation. I didn't answer. I poured my coffee slowly, my silence the only reply. By midday, Claire had already filed the documents. Court orders moved faster than Daniel expected. His accounts, once endless wells of wealth and power, were suddenly frozen. When he tried to make a transfer that afternoon, the bank declined it. His roar echoed through the house, curses spilling into every corner. He smashed a glass against the wall, but I only watched from the doorway, my arms crossed. The king was losing his throne, and he knew it. The rumors began quietly, carried by whispers among friends who had seen too much at the dinner party, who now had proof to pair with their doubts. Megan was the first to share pieces of the truth online, her words sharp and uncompromising. "A man who abandons his wife in labor doesn't deserve to be called a husband." Screenshots trickled onto social media, financial records, emails, snippets of recordings. Within days, the curated image Daniel had polished for years began to fracture in the eyes of everyone who once admired him. And yet, amid the chaos, I found a fragile peace. That evening, as Daniel raged and stormed about the house, I slipped into the nursery. The room smelled faintly of powder and lavender. I lifted my son from the crib, his tiny fist curling around my finger. I pressed my cheek against his soft hair and whispered, "You won't grow up afraid. I promise." My tears wet his blanket, but this time they weren't from despair. They were the release of chains falling away. In the quiet, holding him close, I realized the truth. This battle was never only about punishing Daniel, it was about rewriting my life, about ensuring my child would never see fear as normal, control as love, cruelty as family. Outside the nursery, Daniel's voice bellowed as he demanded answers as he tried to salvage what was slipping through his hands. But inside, in the dim glow of the nightlight, I had already claimed my victory. The first move had been made. The game was no longer his to control. Daniel was cornered, and cornered men become dangerous. The morning after his accounts were frozen, he launched his counterattack with a speed that left me breathless. Papers arrived at my doorstep, legal petitions filed on his behalf. He claimed I was mentally unstable, a woman consumed by paranoia after childbirth, unfit to raise our son. His lawyers painted me as hysterical, fragile, delusional. They argued that my so-called evidence was fabricated, the desperate work of a jealous wife who had lost her grip on reality. Evelyn and Richard joined the performance, standing firmly behind their golden boy. They whispered poison into every ear that would listen. Evelyn, with her practiced grace, told acquaintances that she had caught me flirting with another man, that I had been unfaithful while Daniel worked tirelessly to provide. Richard added his booming certainty, declaring me reckless with money, incapable of managing even the simplest household responsibility. The tabloids fed on it like vultures. Headlines splashed across gossip sites. Unstable wife threatens businessman's future. Allegations of infidelity rock the Carter family. My face, pale and weary, appeared beside Daniel's polished smile. To the outside world, he was the victim, a hard-working husband betrayed by a faithless, unstable wife. For a moment, it felt as though the ground had been pulled from beneath me. Neighbors stopped making eye contact. Friends hesitated before answering my calls. Even the kind nurses at the hospital gave me cautious looks, as if wondering if the rumors were true. The isolation was suffocating, and the walls of my carefully built strategy trembled. But Claire, steadfast as ever, reminded me that storms pass. "Truth leaves footprints," she said, sliding a file across the desk toward me. "And so does deception. We just need the right proof." The proof arrived sooner than either of us expected. Late one evening, Claire called me to her office. A small padded envelope sat on her desk, no return address, the postmark smudged. Inside was a flash drive and a single note scrawled in a hurried hand. "For her, she deserves the truth." We plugged it in, and the room filled with voices. Daniel's voice, commanding. Evelyn's, dripping with contempt. Richard's, cold and calculating. They weren't talking about me in the abstract. They were planning to strip me of custody, to smear my name in the press, to ensure I left with nothing. And then came the proof that shattered their facade entirely. Daniel bragging about the woman he was seeing on the side, a name mentioned carelessly, paired with hotel reservations and business trips that suddenly made sense. I froze, the bile rising in my throat. But Claire leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "This is it. This is our weapon." The trial began under the heavy gaze of flashing cameras and curious spectators. Daniel walked in with his usual confidence, his arm linked with his mother's, his father shadowing them like a fortress. He believed the world still bent in his favor. He didn't know the fortress was already cracking. When it was my turn to speak, I stood tall, my hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. I presented the recordings one by one, each a nail driven into the coffin of Daniel's lies. The courtroom fell silent as his voice filled the air, mocking me, dismissing me, plotting against me. Evelyn paled as her own words echoed back at her, the venom she had always hidden now exposed to every ear. Daniel tried to laugh it off, claiming the clips were doctored, but then came the twist he hadn't prepared for. Oliver. He had stepped forward quietly, but when he did, the entire court leaned in. His testimony confirmed the authenticity of the recordings. He had captured them himself, disgusted by the way the family conspired. He handed over his original files, unedited, undeniable, and as he spoke, a technician played one of the longest recordings over the speakers. The sound rang out, crisp and clear. Daniel's voice boasting about his mistress, detailing how he funneled money through shell accounts, laughing about how easy it was to make me look like a fool. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, Daniel's face drained of color as the reality sank in. And then the final blow. The system glitched, or perhaps it was fate, and the audio streamed not just to the courtroom speakers, but to the monitors lining the hall. Even the newsfeed covering the trial. Every word broadcast live. Every scheme laid bare before the world. Evelyn collapsed into her seat, her pearl necklace snapping as it clattered onto the floor. Richard buried his face in his hands, reputation crumbling before his eyes. Daniel stammered, trying to regain control, but the more he spoke, the deeper he sank. I stood silently, my heart pounding, watching their empire of lies burn. It wasn't just justice, it was exposure. They had built their lives on image, on control, on greed, and now the world saw them as they truly were. The Carters had waged war, but in the end it was their own weapons that destroyed them. The courtroom had become an arena, every seat filled with faces hungry for resolution. Daniel sat at the defendant's table, his once polished confidence unraveling with each passing hour. His suit was immaculate, but his hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale. He tried to speak, tried to twist the narrative, insisting the recordings were manipulated, that Oliver was lying, that I was orchestrating some grand conspiracy. But the words rang hollow against the tidal wave of proof laid bare. Claire stood beside me, her voice calm and measured as she dismantled every argument, every piece of evidence we had gathered, every document, every recording fell into place like stones in a fortress no storm could topple. The jury watched Daniel closely, and I saw in their eyes what I had long known. His arrogance was not strength, it was weakness dressed in silk. When the verdict came, the air thickened with silence. The judge's voice was steady, almost cold, as he announced the decision. Custody of my son granted to me. Financial accounts secured, assets divided fairly, protective measures placed to ensure Daniel could no longer manipulate or threaten. My knees nearly buckled, the weight of years finally lifting. Across the room, Evelyn let out a sharp gasp, clutching her chest as though the words themselves had struck her down. Her pearls scattered once more, rolling across the floor like tiny reminders of her crumbling facade. Richard sat frozen, staring into nothing, his empire of money suddenly stripped of meaning without the illusion of family prestige. Daniel rose, his face red with rage, shouting over the judge, pointing at me with venom. "This isn't over! She's ruined everything! I'll fix this!" His voice cracked into desperation as officers moved closer. He bolted toward the exit, the last flicker of his control burning wildly. But the sound of heavy boots echoed as police intercepted him, pressing him against the wall. The gavel struck once, twice, sealing the moment. I stood in silence, my son cradled in my arms, watching as Daniel was dragged away. For years, he had dictated my every move, my every breath. Now, he was nothing more than a man in chains, undone by his own greed and cruelty. The days that followed felt like walking out of a storm into the soft glow of morning. I moved into a modest apartment, its walls bare, but its air filled with peace. I bought second-hand furniture, painted the nursery a pale shade of blue, and for the first time in years, every decision was mine alone. Freedom wasn't grand or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, a calm heartbeat in the stillness of night. I found work at a small publishing company, a job that allowed me to write and edit from home. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it was mine. The paycheck carried no hidden strings, no silent expectations. I paid the bills with my own name on them, smiled when my card cleared at the grocery store, and felt the ground beneath me grow solid once more. Megan visited often, bringing laughter and food that filled the apartment with warmth. Dr. Harris checked in, ensuring my health was steady. Claire stopped by one evening with a bottle of wine, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "You did it," she said simply. But I knew it wasn't just me. It was every hand that reached out when I had been drowning. At night, when the world slowed, I would sit in the rocking chair beside my son's crib, watching him sleep. His chest rose and fell, his tiny hand curling around his blanket. The scars of the past still lingered, shadows that whispered in the quiet hours, but they no longer owned me. I was not a victim, not merely a survivor, but something stronger. I thought often of forgiveness, of whether I could ever grant it to Daniel, to Evelyn, to the web of cruelty that once bound me. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing not to carry their weight any longer. They would live with the consequences of their choices, and I would live free. One evening, as the city hummed softly beyond my window, I leaned back in the chair and whispered to my sleeping son, "You will never have to fear him. You will never grow up thinking love is pain." My voice caught, and I brushed a tear from my cheek, smiling through it. In that moment, I turned toward the invisible audience I felt had followed me through every storm, every betrayal, every breath of survival. "Sometimes," I whispered, "the sweetest revenge isn't in their downfall. It's in building a life so far out of their reach, they can never touch it." The words settled into the night like a promise, not of vengeance, not of bitterness, but of rebirth.